Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Erin Hoffman, and I'm the Director of Ignatian Initiatives here at Fordham University. Thank you for being here. I'm particularly excited about this event because it's one that several of us have been talking about for several years and finally have the opportunity to bring to fruition. Thank you very much in advance to our panelists for being here and to my colleagues in the Center on Religion and Culture, David Gibson and David Goodwin, as well as Director of Mission Extension and Campus Ministry, Connor O'Kane, for your collaboration and efforts in bringing this to life, and certainly to our students in the Filmmaking Club who've partnered with us to prepare our opening segment and our trivia tonight. Jedi and Jesuits is one of many events this Ignatian Week. While we are proud to live out our Jesuit identity every day of the year at Fordham, Ignatian Week is a special opportunity to celebrate the rich tradition of which we are a part. Going all the way back to the founder of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius Loyola himself, who encouraged the early Jesuits to do things like find God in all things, spend time in action and contemplation, care for the whole person, do all things for the greater glory of God, and go set the world on fire. Challenges that are familiar to us today, almost 500 years later, by virtue of our participation at Fordham, a Jesuit university. Ignatian Week highlights some of the foundations of what it means to be a Jesuit university: service and justice, faith and spirituality, academic excellence and engagement with the world in which we are a part. After tonight, there's one more opportunity tomorrow to participate at Rose Hill, featuring a Fordham alum and current Jesuit scholastic, Michael Martinez, who's performing and speaking about the power of hip-hop, media, and faith. At Fordham, it's important to the life of our university and the care of our students that we continue the efforts that we celebrate this Ignatian Week throughout the whole year. In campus ministry, we seek to support our students, inclusive of all faiths and experiences, so that you can have the best Fordham experience possible, that you can be your best you possible, so that you can thrive. And Fordham Center on Religion and Culture explores complex relationship between faith and contemporary life at a time when religion's role in American life is both praised and contested. We both welcome you to learn more and get involved in upcoming events and opportunities, and that you find your experience at Fordham, in whatever role you find yourself here tonight and for however long, one in which you can embrace and celebrate Ignatian values, spirit, and tradition in your everyday life, so that you too can go forth and set the world on fire. And in that quest, may the force be with you.
My name is David Goodwin. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center on Religion and Culture here at Fordham. Throughout the academic year, the Center puts on public events discussing any subject where religion and culture intersect. So that could be something such as Star Wars, which we're discussing tonight, or it could be something along the lines of our November 4th event, discussing Pope Francis. This is entitled Pope Francis, Reform and Resistance. And I imagine subjects near and dear to Pope Francis' heart will be discussed, such as the Amazon, such as the environment. So if you're free that evening on November 4th, I encourage you to join us. And I would like to thank Erin and Connor and the entire campus ministry staff for inviting me and the center to be a part of tonight. And most importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and sharing your evening with us, especially I know it's midterms for the students, so your time is important and valuable to you. When I was watching that trailer, I couldn't help but feel this electric charge like course through my body. And I remembered seeing Star Wars as a child. And I'm dating myself here, but I remember seeing Return of the Jedi with my father and my younger brother in the theater. And whenever I hear the John Williams score, or whenever I see the binary sunset, or Ben Kenobi flash his wry smile as Vader slices into the lightsaber, I can't help but experience those films for the first time again. And I feel my imagination lit a fire again. And I cite Star Wars as inspiring a lifelong passion for stories in me, whether that be in film, whether that be in novels, whether that be in music. And tonight I'm hoping you'll share your Star Wars experiences with us and tell us how they impacted you. Before we begin, I just want to present a few questions that I hope you carry in your mind as we talk tonight. One, is Star Wars something profound, something more than just a movie? Or is it just simple popcorn entertainment? And I'm hoping our illustrious panelists might be able to help us solve those questions this evening. Our first panelist is Jack Jenkins. He's an award-winning journalist and national reporter for the Religion News Service, where he covers Catholicism and the intersection of religion and politics. His stories and analysis have been published in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Huffington Post, and the National Catholic Reporter. He's a lifelong Star Wars fan and dreams of one day becoming a gray Jedi. And kudos to anyone who gets that reference, because I do not. So, give a round of applause for Jack. Our second panelist is one of Fordham's own, Dr. Kathryn Reklis, an associate professor of theology at Fordham University. She teaches classes on religion and colonialism, digital religion, and religion and culture, including pop culture. She also writes a monthly column on film, television, and pop culture for the Christian Century. And she is currently working her way through the Star Wars canon for the second time with her 9-year-old son in preparation for the rise of Skywalker. And our final round of applause for Scott. And our final panelist is a Jesuit priest, Father Jim McDermott. He is also a screenwriter and a resident of Los Angeles and a correspondent for American Magazine. He was a staff writer on the first season of the television show Preacher and does a weekly newsletter about pop culture and spirituality called Pop Culture Speaker Wow. He's also currently working on articles for American Magazine on The Exorcist. Hopefully it'll come out in time for Halloween, and The Mission. Tomorrow. He regularly gets Luke on BuzzFeed's Which Star Wars Character Are You? So before we begin with more in-depth questions, I'd like to just get your reactions to the trailer.
To what we just watched?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I thought it was beautiful. I find the same, that personally, it's always stirring. The John Williams music in and of itself it pines. I think that's what it is for me, and that's been true for me for the Star Wars series. There's a sense of longing always to the Star Wars mythology, to the films, that, yeah, it just hits a real deep place in me. So yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Thanks a lot. I mean, I think I love the choice of bringing our attention specifically to the Force, which I think we've been just chatting in the wings and thinking about on a panel like this, trying to think about what is this, what is the Force in the Star Wars mythology, and how does our understanding of what it is change across the arc of the different episodes? And that was all completely raised for me by that particular editing.
Yeah, well done, future George Lucas. And yeah, what I really liked too was that you have a specific edit from Luke, young Luke, to old Luke, which interestingly, people don't do that often, and it reminds you that there is that consistent character arc. And what I really like about kind of what that trailer did was remind us of kind of the dynamic of family and the dynamic of this. This is kind of this almost royal epic. At least the Skywalker series, where we're following this family through time, and it's imbued with deep, intense tragedy. Like several of the references in that trailer were deaths, and like that's just accepted as a part of this story, is that there is these great triumphs, but embedded within them is this tragedy that you overcome with the next triumph and continue on, which is the kind of complexity we would expect from a complicated family. So I really dug it. Well done.
I just want to share a quote with you from George Lucas. In 1999, June 1999, so this would have been right when the first prequel, Shall Remain Unmentioned, was released. He sat down with Bill Morris to talk about Star Wars and his vision and creation of the series. And George Lucas went on to say that he, quote, put the Force into the movies in order to try to awaken a certain kind of spirituality in young people. end quote. And he went on to say, quote, I hope that it doesn't end up being the course that this whole thing, that being Star Wars, takes. Because I think that there's definitely a place for organized religion, and it's very important part of the social fabric. I would hate to find ourselves in a completely secular world where entertainment was passing for some kind of religious experience, end quote. Do you think he achieved those goals? One, that Star Wars awakened this new sense of spirituality in people, but also that it didn't become a quasi-religion, that film and Star Wars didn't become a quasi-religion.
Go this way.
Okay.
I'll always be in the middle.
I was telling a friend before I got here that there's never been a panel in my life that I've because I know that quote. I've read it 1,000 times. And that whole interview you should watch, by the way, when George Lucas talks about religion in Star Wars. It's a fascinating interview. I think one of the dynamics that's endemic to art is that you kind of don't have full control over how it's perceived and used by those. And so I think there's an element of Star Wars where technically, literally, Jediism is a religion, literally, in the United Kingdom. You can check that box. People have technically classified themselves as Jedi, both in Australia and the United States. And it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, like it's like a joke, it's kind of like a projection of organized religion in some capacity. But also it's not, because people, definitely gather together for very specific, like lightsaber battle events and those sorts of things. And there's any number of scholarly arguments of like the delineation between what's fun and what's an actual religion, and whether that we could talk about Halal Assad and whether or not those categorical differences actually exist between what is or isn't a religion. But I definitely think that George Lucas, if he thought that people wouldn't find profound religious meaning in his movies, that's wrong. Like, I do believe people have found profound meaning in his films and in the universe he created. Whether that counts as religious, I think, is up to the individual who's consuming it. Conversely, I'm more curious about whether or not people saw the force that he put into the movies, and people were So I don't have a pure answer for that in terms of whether or not the people understood what he was trying to do with the Force. Because I, as a religious person who studies religion, when I heard that line from him, I was actually surprised that he was very intentional about putting it in there. But I deferred to the experts in these fields.
No, I agree with all of those things. I mean, I think maybe more interesting to me is to think about. Well, I think we're going to get to this a lot tonight, but about all the different ways something like religion functions in Star Wars. So we can talk about the Force, and then we can talk about all of the ways different Force wielders show up in different parts of the universe and how we read that or map that on to what we think of as religious life or parallels with religious life. I think all of us are super interested in thinking about the critique of institutional religion that is maybe hardwired into the universe's mythology, or maybe is a kind of an evolving part of that mythology, something that the myth has to start reckoning with because of the events internal to the story. So those are actually more interesting questions to me. I think if the question is, if the question is either, did Star Wars contribute to the decline of institutional religion? I think, no, that's too simplistic. There's like way too many other things that are contributing to that. Does Star Wars completely take the place of institutional religion? No, I don't think it really does that either. But I am super interested in the question of what Lucas thought a myth was and how he thought a film could operate as a myth and how that myth is changing, like how it's evolving and maybe asking different things of the audience now than it did in 1976 when he was playing with this archetype of the mythological hero. So, yeah, I want to talk about all those things. Yeah.
I was sort of touched by the quote because I too, I was very surprised that those were part of his reflections. I think in part because I feel like what Star Wars seems to do for a lot of people is it provides a spiritual experience. And as a result, whether that leads people to one form or another of institutionalized religion, I feel like it definitely raises questions about like what did just happen to me? What did I just watch? And I don't know. I would love to see Kara do a study of the effects of a movie like Star Wars on people's sort of willingness to consider institutionalized religion. I think once you get to, the other reason I'm really surprised by the quote, speaking to Kathryn's point in a way, once you get to the prequels, they seem to me a pretty strong critique of organized religion and a potent one in some ways. So yeah, I mean, I was sort of reveling in the fact that this order that in the first three movies we sort of discover as this sort of very spiritual, interesting, mysterious group, then when you get to the bureaucracy is a nightmare and is sort of cold and willing to take children from their parents and not liberate their parents when you liberate the children and things like that. It was shocking, and I don't know if that's George, if he was aware that he was doing that, or if he thought, well, this is religion and this is kind of part of how it works. But yeah, that's.
So I just want to step back from Star Wars specifically for a moment and talk about science fiction in general. And sci-fi, really since it was a genre, whether in novels or in film, has probed big, difficult, even unanswerable questions: reality, death, God. And think The Matrix, think Black Mirror, think Twilight Zone, think Star Wars. Why might that be? Do you think we need this cover of science fiction to explore and grapple with these difficult questions? I mean, why is science fiction sort of fertile ground for such philosophical, theological wranglings?
Well, okay, I'll go I guess I have to go first sometime. I mean, I guess like the sociologist of religion in me would say, yeah, of course, like you have to have, I mean, you don't have anything going in a society without stories, right? It's the need to give what, right, a sociologist may legitimation, right, an explanation for how things work, what things are, what things mean, right, is core to how humans organize themselves into collectives and make sense of themselves. And when a story really works, or when it works in a society, it makes something about the structures or orders of that society seem really real, right? And to the people in it. Right? It makes it seem real to them, and it matches, it kind of creates an insideness that matches the outsideness. And so I think this is integral to like what Lucas thought he was up to, at least in the 70s. Right? It was a sense that that there was a time when we shared common stories that come, let's say, from more traditional religious traditions, and more people were united by them, and they did this work, right? They shaped inner lives to match outer lives, to the reality of the world, and that wasn't happening, right? That the sense that had broken apart in the 60s and 70s, and so his attraction to this idea of the myth as doing this, and his almost an experiment to see could he write a myth. And I would say that right, the sci-fi genre has always like kind of like scholars of religion like myself and others, we love this stuff, right? It's so, because you can't help but see parallels, right, to the kinds of world building and explanatory power that religious traditions, right, have also cultivated in different ways, right? And I think a lot of it is intentional on the part of sci-fi pop culture creators, right? They know what they're doing, right? They are actively trying to activate that part. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think it's interesting to me. I mean, I personally don't buy at all Joseph Campbell's theory. Like, I study colonialism. That is just a product of colonialism in my mind. And it's a desire to like find what's lacking in the Western, dry, rational, arid world of the Western mind, to find in some other primitive land, right, in pieces of mythology, the answer to that problem, like to save ourselves by looking at these other sources. So I don't really buy that, but I also think Lucas made a real myth, a myth that shapes people's inner dispositions and organizes the way they feel and think and are motivated to act in the world. So that's why I'm actually interested in how that myth has changed. I think we're way beyond Joseph Campbell now, right, in the Star Wars world. Like, I think it has just exploded beyond the Joseph Campbell model of if you don't know this model, like the hero who sets out on a quest, a kind of spiritual self-discovery, and in so doing is able to like reinvigorate his or her society through a kind of spiritual initiation and grappling, which becomes both an identity of self and kind of communal renewal. I think we've shot beyond that, and I find super interesting.
And I'll just, to add to that, I would really love to hear more about the critique of Joseph Campbell, because I don't know if people know what we're talking about when we say that in terms of, like, Joseph Campbell was the mentor of George Lucas, hero of 1,000 faces, like, George Lucas referred to him as his mentor, and so apparently that was instrumental in how he formed Star Wars. But, like, the premise of Joseph Campbell was, like, these stories are, you know, Harry Potter, Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings all follow similar themes here, and they're like, these are endemic to all of humanity, which is false. Like, you just look at other myths that other societies have put together, and they're clearly not following the same trope, which I feel like The Last Jedi is like a very systemic, like, heck no to that over and over and over again. But I'll also note that what I find really interesting about, like you said, about the Star Wars universe since then is it's kind of like folded in on itself, where it's become its own critique of its own, the narrative that supposedly raised Lucas to where he was. But to your original question about science fiction, I will say on a practical level, one of the reasons I think that science fiction becomes this way that we can explore deeper theological and ideological and political questions is practically because if you tell a story, for instance, set in the Deep South, well, people are going to have a very specific perception of what belongs in the Deep South. If you set it in northern Minnesota, they're going to ask a whole lot of questions about the accents, right? But if you invent a whole other world, or you invent a future in which you set the terms of that future, you're allowed to kind of craft the question that is asked in the course of that story more specifically. It's more of a vacuum. Now, interestingly, once you create that universe and you try to add more things to it, people like me say, well, you're breaking the canon there. Like, you said that one thing, but Wookiees don't talk like that. But I think that's my guess as to why science fiction often becomes this method through which we're able to explore deeper questions, is because we don't have to get bogged down. It's easier to suspend our disbelief when they already have lightsabers and are flying through space with sound. Like, we just accept it because it's a different.
It's interesting. I'm listening to you guys and thinking that in terms of science fiction, David, as you're asking, usually it has some sort of social critique. That's part of what makes it interesting. But if I look at the trilogies, right? So the first trilogy, I would say, is not that kind of science fiction at all. It is myth making, and it doesn't seem at all interested, really, in sort of the society that we live in. It's maybe interested in family, and the family that George Lucas comes from, and things like that. The second trilogy, I'd say, the prequels, maybe there's a social critique, but it's sort of in spite of itself and not really well understood, I think. Like, I think there's interesting things being done there, but it's so overwrought, and I don't think it's what Lucas was intending, so it doesn't really work. And then the third trilogy, I don't know if it began, the most recent, whether it began, and I'm going to actually put Rogue One in this as well, whether those films began as sort of looking at the society that we're living in, but certainly Rogue One and The Last Jedi are very much speaking to the world that we're living in, and sort of the way that we think about community and hope, hope against despair. Like, those themes resonate in a different way today than they did in the 1970s. So yeah, it's so interesting to have a series of 8 films that have been done over 30 years, like what that is, what they mean by things like myth or story or science fiction. They can evolve in so many ways. I just don't know another property or story like that. Star Trek maybe, except Star Trek's kind of stayed static in a way, mostly.
All right, so I want to gravitate back to Star Wars, and hopefully my mic will cooperate. So I would like us to explore the Jedis and the Force and how they're portrayed in the films and how they evolve through the series, and what might be some religious or spiritual or mythological themes or underpinnings that you might see in the Jedi Order and the portrayal of the Force?
Actually, can I say one last thing on the last point?
You can say anything you'd like.
I'm very preoccupied by that question. You know, there is one thing about the first trilogy, which I think is true of the whole saga, that is, I think, a social critique, and maybe it speaks to the Campbell point, Kathryn, that you're making. Tell me what you think. That the interesting thing about Star Wars for me, as compared to, say, Star Trek, is that in Star Wars, every character that you meet is somebody's favorite. They could be on screen for like a second, but there's someone, like people who, some of the names today, you know, like some of those characters are not major characters, but people are fascinated by them, right? There's something, I think, cooked into the Star Wars world that everybody is somebody. Everybody is the hero of a story of a sort, whether or not you get to see all of that story or not. And that is an interesting, as compared to, say, Star Trek, which is really about a group of Western people who go places and meet people that are pretty kind of vague, right? It's really the story of those mostly Western people. I don't know, does that resonate at all?
Yeah, yes, completely. I mean, I will admit, I think I'm the only person on this panel who didn't grow up watching Star Wars, so I came to Star Wars as like a young adult, and I've done my best, but I also have like a 9-year-old son, and so that means now that I am like enmeshed in a world of YouTube, fanfic, Star Wars theory, spin-off videos, and he will come to me with information and debates, and anytime I ask him, he is like down this rabbit hole, and I cannot, exactly, I was like, you know what, it's the best I can give him. I can absolutely, I'm watching it in action, right, that sense of the kind of endless possibility to connect at various points of the world. But I mean, I think we could so maybe going back to David's question about how do we think about the Jedi? How have the Jedi changed? And obviously we're in the midst of, we're waiting like to see what is this? Like the Last Jedi offers us, I think, its own meta rewrite of the whole mythology. And Rogue One too, I would agree, right? It sort of takes what's latent in the prequels, and you were saying this, right? The disappointment that we experience when we have the hint of Obi-Wan's. A good friend was talking me through all of his deep childhood feelings about this, and I was catching up with the experience of having watched these as a young adult and not having quite the level of disappointment and at that visceral existential level, but that sense of like the hint of the mystery of this order, like who are the Jedi? When Obi-Wan says, you know, they used to rule the galaxy and bring peace for 1,000 years, and you're like, what is this order? And what can they do? And who are they? And are they priests, or are they warriors, or are they Buddhist monk-like self-renunciating mystics? Like how do we understand their parallel? And then you get the prequels, and you're like, oh my God, they're just like bureaucratic, semi-religious figures who've like totally sold out and are completely aligned with the aims of the state and are perpetuating this war and aren't even very good at it and can't see anything that's happening around them. And so it's so disappointing. I think we were saying is like, but is that the beginning, right? Did Lucas know that was a critique of institutional religion or power? Or is it something that these later movies, Rogue One and The Last Jedi, right? They are clearly going for that, right? Luke has that whole speech in The Last Jedi, right, where he basically lays that out. Like, you saw the prequels, like, you know how bad this was. Like, the Jedi are the ones who brought this on us, right? They were blinded. They were sold out, right? They aligned themselves with power. They trained Anakin. Like, they didn't even see the Darth Lord rising up around them, right? All of this saga is their fault. And he's giving us, right, this kind of meta-canonical revision of the whole myth. And so, I mean, I'm super interested in how much we think that's been there all along, right? Or how much this is the introduction, right, of a kind of maybe a new age, a new moment, right? I have so many more. I have literally so many more things I could say, but I'll stop.
Well, just to add to that, first of all, for the Force, we have to acknowledge that midichlorians were mentioned and then ignore them forever, which is what we have done. But in terms of like the Jedi, I'm right there with you. The crazy thing about the Jedi as an institution is that it kind of feels like, my guess is that if George Lucas did not design the prequels intentionally to kind of pull back the curtain around the Jedi to kind of see that while many of these are very well-intentioned or even virtuous people, that it has huge flaws. If he wasn't even doing that intentionally, it de facto occurred by trying to create the conditions under which Anakin Skywalker would fall. Like, the greatest tragedy of the prequels for me is that you can watch them and you're like, there is a good story in this, and there's just too much CG in front of it for it to actually occur. And it's also a great allegory on why fascism occurs, which was taken as passé at the time. It's less passé now. But I think it's really interesting that what we have in that moment in the cave with Luke in The Last Jedi is him kind of confronting basically the obvious narrative, like you said, of the prequels, where it's like, y'all, this. I mean, and in some ways, it's like him, not wanting to even acknowledge, that evil is complicated. But that's kind of like the ultimate meta-narrative of The Last Jedi, is that evil is complicated. It doesn't sit firmly on the light side or the dark side, which is why I love characters like Maz Kanata, who is force sensitive but isn't on either side of the binary. And it's why I love the joke that no one got in my bio. A gray Jedi is this concept of a Jedi who kind of walks that line between the two worlds. And there you go. Thank you. And
those fan videos.
Yes. Yeah. And then if I hope I might be the only person on stage who's consumed all of the Clone Wars. Thank you. So because those are canon, and Ahsoka leaving the Jedi Order, the context under which that occurs, it is also this giant critique. And I think there's no way to read that if you take Luke Skywalker on his word when he refers to the Jedi religion in The Last Jedi and refers to the books as the sacred Jedi texts. The Jedi Order is a religious institution, and thus, the flaws that are exposed over the course of the prequels and now even in the new trilogy are critiques of an institutional religion, which is also, I don't want to go on for too long, but why I love Rogue One, because Rogue One is effectively the perspective of the laity in that context. Whether it's Chirrut Imwe, who is the blind monk, who it's never totally clear if he's force sensitive or not, but if he's not, that's even better. Because it's his devotion is so pure, but somehow it's Jedi-like powers just because he's that cool. And then also you have Jyn Erso, who fingers her Kyber crystal necklace in time, utters this silent prayer in the movie, which is of course a Jedi relic, right? So it's this these tangible objects connected to the Jedi religion that are lived out by these individuals that then sacrifice their entire lives. Spoiler alert, everyone in Rogue One dies. And they do that for this higher cause. And they don't get the applause that Luke Skywalker does, and they don't get to wave a lightsaber around, they just get killed by them. But the ultimate result is that they are the ones who are in many ways upholding the ideals of the religion when the institution of the Jedi failed to do so.
I want to say something to that, but you might want to say something.
Go ahead. I'll follow you.
It's a little thing, because I was thinking so much about Jyn's necklace, and I was thinking, I love it because it got me in this whole, myself ready to make a YouTube fanfic video, thinking about how I could concoct this whole story of her parents, right, in tight with the Empire, in that, but there's a little flashback there, a cocktail party, they're in deep in the power structures, and then something happens, right? They have some conversion moment, they see it for what it is, and they get out, and they go, right? They go into hiding, and they're living there, and it's her mom that gives her this Kyber crystal, and you can imagine, right, that they've had maybe something like a religious conversion to not choose to build this weapon, to get out. But it's clear that whatever that Kyber crystal necklace means to them or means in the larger structure of Jedi religion, it's not been passed on to Jyn. Right? It's a relic of her mom, and she knows it has the practice of fingering it, the practice of using it to center herself. It brings about, it gives her what she needs, right? It's efficacious, and yet she has we could say in religion, no catechetical knowledge, right? She has not been properly taught what this means. And it really raises the question of what was this religion for lay people, right? you have Jedi and you have temples and you have priestly orders, but in what way was it efficacious for ordinary people, and how is it being transformed by Jin right there in that moment, who's seeking something from it but doesn't know what she's seeking?
There's a ritual without having. In fact, we probably reject being trying to be taught it anyway, right? Yeah, 100%.
Which the Tycho sisters then sort of echo, don't they, in The Last Jedi with the medals that they each wear. It's a different medal. It's not a kyber crystal, but there's certainly some kind of. It's definitely a relic of each other, but there's something more to it. They each look at it at kind of the key moments. Paige looks at it, right, Paige, before she blows up the destroyer, or and then Rose looks at it at other times. You know, for me, the thing I'm thinking about as I'm listening, I rewatched the most recent two films recently, and in a way, it's much more clear in The Last Jedi, but I think it haunts both films. They're sort of about the 18 years between when Ben Kenobi lands on Tatooine and when Luke comes of age. Like that's a weird time. That's like the hidden life of Ben Kenobi, and it should be a very sad time in his life because he blew it. Like he is the embodiment of the failure, but we never see that. We never get that journey of his, because it was the first movie, and I'm sure that Alec Guinness had no idea, or maybe even George Lucas, like, what is that story? So we get the sort of the mystery and wisdom of it, but there is so much sorrow and failure and loss, and it's like a piece of the mythology that it probably helps make the prequels awful, because, well, the Obi-Wan movie, but in a way I think The Last Jedi is the Obi-Wan movie because you get to watch someone who made the same mistakes. Not quite as bad, but we'll see. We'll see what happens in The Rise of Skywalker. No, I'm thinking actually of Luke. Like Luke went through a very similar journey as Ben. He trained a Jedi who then went bad, and not only that, who has done just terrible, terrible things, murdered people. The murders that we've seen that Kylo Ren has done, in a sense, are more catastrophic at times, like the beginning of The Force Awakens, where it's just like murder this whole village, and we get to watch it. Like they didn't do that with Darth Vader. So I just think that the series has been kind of haunted by where is the failure, where is the loss, and I don't know what The Rise of Skywalker does with that, but The Force Awakens, for me, it's so satisfying because it gives us that journey. I think that's part of religion as well. Our religion, other religions, and without that sense of failure and loss, that it becomes like what you see in the prequels. It's just arrogant and cold.
I'm glad we mentioned The Last Jedi, because I have a few questions I'd like to delve into. So, Last Jedi, for better or worse, merited quite a bit of criticism, especially from maybe the darker regions of fandom. And the issues of canon and cancel culture come up in that discussion. So I'm just wondering if the three of you might want to explore that idea a little bit.
Sure. I'll just say a word to start. How about that? Well, actually, so cancel culture, that whole idea. I think it actually comes from a good place, although it can be very dark. And the good place that it comes from is that the audience feels like the keepers of the story. At some point, we invest in it, and we feel like we know where the lines are, where it's no longer really what Star Wars is, or it is part of it. And I find that fascinating because I think that's a similar thing that happens in the church. I don't want to go too far off the Star Wars conversation we've been having, but if I look at some of the critiques of Pope Francis, what's really going on there? There's certainly a lot of things going on there, but one of them might be people saying, this isn't the church. Like you've broken the canon. This isn't the story. You're telling some other story. Like that same critique, I think you can turn back around with either the church or with Star Wars. You can say, well, actually, but here are the pieces in which this is actually eminently consistent or expands on the canon in a way that's essential if it's going to live. If it's not just going to be a repeat, if it's not going to be, say, the critique of The Force Awakens. Well, I've already seen that movie. It was called Star Wars, and then it was called Return of the Jedi. Where it's another Death Star, another this or another that. If it's going to live, it has to be able to breathe and change like we do. But I think it's I think cancel culture gets dismissed too readily in some ways because the fans do have a role to play. They're sort of they're the keepers of the story, and if it's breaking the rules, I think they have a responsibility in some way to say that to the author, to the creators. I don't know.
Well, I think there are several elements to the cancel culture there. I'm one of the actresses who is harassed horrendously just for existing. That I feel like, that's endemic to our times. Also, Rogue One, there was a bunch of white supremacists that protested the film. And I want to be like, did you think you were the heroes before? What did you think Star Wars was in the first go-round? But I will say that, with The Last Jedi, I'm among those people who when I'm at a table with people talking about The Last Jedi, I make everyone mad because my disposition is that I had problems with the film, but I loved all of the ideas. So it's I think Luke absolutely should be a curmudgeon. I hope that Rey's parents came from nothing. I hope she has zero parentage of Skywalker blood. All these things that made all these other people irked. I was I'm on board with that. I just felt like there should have been slightly less time in a casino planet. That was basically my
Yeah.
But I do think there is a difficulty because the fact that you're raising a child with this movie is a reminder to all of us that Star Wars, this movie is old, but it was made for children. You know what I mean? It is a myth that you can enjoy, people of all ages, but it doesn't necessarily age with you. Whereas movies like Rogue One and Solo, which is an underrated film, by the way.
Agreed.
Those are kind of I kind of see Disney being we're still going to make the trilogy where kids can enjoy this. You adults, you can go watch everyone die. You know what I mean? You can enjoy those sorts of more adult narratives. And I think that's an interesting thing about Star Wars that's not the same with a lot of other narratives, is that they have, at some level, Star Wars can't age with you. There's certain elements that the narrative needs to be able to appeal to a generation, at its very core at a young age. And so I feel a lot of what happened with The Last Jedi is they were you're being clumsy with these people that raised me, with and why would you do that? And it's a really, the lines are actually repeatedly in the, I feel The Last Jedi recognizes exactly what it's doing and stares at the audience and breaks the fourth wall and is we are what they grow beyond. That's Yoda tells them right to the camera, and they're they're get really mad and push back on Yoda because they're not getting what's really happening, I think, in The Last Jedi, which is that one is deconstructing the myths that I feel you were talking about, and for a whole generation they really, that myth became important to them. And two, there's a reason that kids still love going to see The Last Jedi. And I think that for me, that skips, cancel culture gets lost within that, which is that millions of people still went to see it, and there's still kids running around with porks as dolls because they love that stuff. So the same reason you would, I feel the earliest cancel culture against Star Wars was the hatred of Ewoks, which was poor because they were awesome. But I feel that's.
I mean, I think I would agree and echo all of those things that you all said. I think maybe one thing to say is that, I think we agree pretty strongly about all of our general takes on The Last Jedi. I really loved it. And actually, I want to make a pitch for the Casino Planet sideline because to me, actually, where the myth actually changed for me was not Luke. Luke was trying to wrap up just basically trying to gather the pieces that had been scattered and give us the loss and the doubt and the suffering internal to this, and then help us interpret the arc that we had already seen from the prequels on. But where the myth changed for me is when Poe Dameron is looking out the window, watching all of those cruisers be shot out of the sky, and he realizes, and we realize, that old model of throw caution to the wind, head out on the daring mission. The hero knows when to say no to order and break the rules and just be an individual hero actually has led to all of that death. Their mission was completely unsuccessful, and because they were captured and accidentally gave up the plan, right? All of the good guys are killed. And if they had just stayed put and acted as a collective, the plan might have worked. And so to me, that was where the myth changed, was actually less in Luke and actually in like suggesting that whole model of individual hero, like rogue pilot flies in and takes out the Death Star in one dramatic shot, like is not the model that can be like the model for the resistance or the rebellion for all of its action. And that's actually why I loved it. I needed those digressions, which we were like, oh, are we just on one of those fun lark rides? And this is and then you're like, no, this is going to turn out to be a horrible, tragic mistake. It's not going to save anybody or anything.
I mean, actually, to that point, well, first of all, I think Poe Dameron may be the real villain of The Last Jedi, because he's responsible for the deaths at the beginning and at the end. There's only like 20 people left, and it's because he had all the at the beginning, all those ships are destroyed, and at the end, all those people get shot down before they reach the planet, and that's because of the plan. I'm not a fan of Poe Dameron. But also, I had never thought of this until you were talking, Kevin, but Canto Bight, the casino planet, that's where we start talking about sort of the social injustice issues. That's where we find out that Rose was a slave, and we meet those 3 slave kids, and it's also where we meet the thief whose name I can never remember, the hacker. DJ, sorry. Who kind of brings the question alive, like, this side that you support, they're buying weapons too, and they're buying weapons from these people who are living life, living high on the hog. Like, those are concepts that I don't think I've ever seen in a Star Wars film before. That sort of social critique. And I don't know where you take that in The Rise of Skywalker, but I thought it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, I guess it's not so bad.
It goes on a long time.
No, I mean, it really, for me, it's more about duration. But I mean, again, the parts that I'm like, why are they riding giant furry things? And the kid beside me is like loving it. So I'm like, that's why. But also like, but I will. I thought that was really interesting too, the way they kind of critique in a way that's accessible to a broad audience, kind of class, and that comes up in Solo as well in a really strong way. Like they deal with class a lot in Solo. But that's, again, more for an audience like myself, whereas like kids can see, like, identify with that kid who like lightsaber at the end, and they can see themselves in that child. And of course, one of my favorite things in the entire film is at the end of the film, a kid is telling the story of Star Wars to other kids as like this, like the power of storytelling is like wrapped within it, which is like, again, the film seems like intensely self-aware in that regard. But I guess I can see. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Star Wars gambling. I have a Sabacc deck. But I'm learning here.
So I have plenty more questions. I'm sure the 4 of us could talk all night, but we want to hear from you. So just wait one moment till we get the mic on the stand. We're having some sound issues tonight, so I'm going to ask everyone who would like to ask a question to go to the standing mic. Put your question in the form of a full question, and then allow the speakers to answer. If you have a follow-up question, wait till they're done speaking and present the follow-up question.
So what's your view on the Mortis trio, and what do you think they represent?
Say that again.
What's your view on the Mortis trio?
From the
From Clone Wars and all that, father, daughter, and son.
Yeah,
That's a good question.
great question. I know.
You're the one who's watching like Clone Wars.
No, we can't watch the Clone Wars until Disney Plus comes out again. So like we watched it all on Netflix like a year and a half ago, and then we're waiting. But so it's been a while since I've like thought about it. What do they represent?
Can I?
Yeah.
So are these like the Force people?
Yeah.
Can you refresh for us and for the audience?
Yeah. So there's this whole thing in the Clone Wars. There's this whole like couple of episodes where they get this mysterious signal and they go to this weird like space temple, like ring world, like it's like a weird thing, and they meet like these almost like godlike Force users. So there's like the son, who's the pure dark side, pure embodiment of the dark side, the daughter, pure embodiment of the light side, and then the father, who's like the balance. And then in some extended universe, there's also the mother, which is like the embodiment of all three, but that's like going way out there. So sort of like how do you view them in the concept of the religion of the Force?
I mean, so this may be a dodge, but because they are canon, Clone Wars is canon, and do they come back in the in Rebels?
They came back in Rebels. They were with like the whole time travel thing, and they were like on the temple and all that.
I mean, the thing that I take from it is sort of that even what we have already is just like the beginning of what this is. And by allowing it to be canon, because if it were me, I would probably say that is so far out. I don't think that can be canon. But the fact that they've agreed to that is to say, like, we have so much more room to explore. Things like time travel and they're sort of like witches too, right? Yeah.
The witches are more of the Night Sisters.
Sorry.
No, but I actually, I would just build on that and say, they clearly represent some kind of deep, like, whatever that Manichaean dualistic drive of the Force, which I think is, like, embodied in the worst of possible ways, in, like, the glowing blood eyes of Anakin when he, like, switches from good to evil, right, in Revenge. But that idea that the Force is literally can be split into these two truly opposing forces, right? A very kind of dualistic world. In some ways it's just a kind of full fledging out, like somebody taking that, right? Experimenting with that, separating out. But I would say, to me, the most interesting thing about it is that it adds to our sense of the Jedi as actually just one really particular religious instantiation of the power of the Force. Right, that they're one order that has developed means of harnessing, using, refining the Force, but that it doesn't even begin to touch, right, what other people can do with this, and even who's sensitive to it or who can use it and what they're capable of doing with it.
And just to add to that, what I remember watching those and being like, this just got real trippy real quick. But at the same time, what I really loved about that was it challenged the traditional Star Wars concept of a religion, right? So where it was basically like this, sort of Jesuit style Jedi with a dualistic understanding of the Force, overlaid with a quasi-Buddhist structure, and those characters introduce a form of religious understanding that comes from very different parts of the world, whether it's Greek or Polynesian, like a different concept of gods and deities that aren't necessarily. You start to understand the anthropomorphization of the Force in a very different way than Yoda or even Obi-Wan articulated it to Luke. And so I really liked what they were doing with that, and I never took it as, and this is where the Force stops. What I took that entire series of episodes, and when they come back, is that the Force gets real weird, and it gets really interesting, and it is, like you said, far beyond the binary that the Jedi and the Sith have set up. And that while clearly there's a binary that's embodied in that trio, although they kind of unsettle it themselves, and they have their own palace intrigue that it tells a different kind of story than this great cosmic clash that the Jedi and Sith want to oversimplify. And so again, just to echo you again, the idea that this is the Force has room for those sorts of expressions and weird little angular universes, as well as, and then there was when Yoda, I forget the name of the planet.
Oh, he goes to that one planet where he meets the mask ladies.
It gets awesome, and it gets hyper complicated in ways that make it incredibly difficult to pin down the Force. And for me, I really loved that because for a while we thought the Force was just kind of God and you can move stuff with your hands, and then now it's no, it's just way bigger and infinite permutations, and so the mystery became back for me, and those sorts of stories.
Thank you.
We have other questions.
Yeah, let me ask one. Thank you very much for the framing. I love the idea, especially Kathryn, with the Jedi sort of were the problem here for 1,000 years. This institutionalized religion that had created this bureaucracy and this church and state kind of thing, and it sounds a little bit to me like a Reformation narrative. So my question is, Star Wars Protestant or Catholic?
I have thoughts on this.
It goes back to the PC-Mac debate that Umberto Eco started. Or now that you just talked about that, Jack, or is it Pentecostal?
Well, so I mean, I do not think you can answer this question because I actually think the Force is too complicated for that. But I did have a question, maybe especially to our Jesuit. So if part of what's happening in The Last Jedi, and then we've already named lots of other places, so lots of other places in the whole canonical mythology where we see that the Force is not just wielded by the Jedi or the Sith, right? It pops up, it can be taken on by people in lots of different ways. But in The Last Jedi, when Luke is in the tree, Yoda has lit the tree on fire, it's burning, and in it are all the sacred texts, right? It's this sense of the end of religion. And I really did think, I was like, is this like the Protestant iconoclastic, like burning of the idols, right? The idols to your religion, smash them, the priesthood of all believers, right? Open up the power of the religion to all, do away with the priestly class? Or is it like using totally inappropriate Christian frame that I don't think is exactly the right one? Is it a Pentecost? Is it, right, the fire, which I don't know how many of you had to take Introduction to New Testament as your sacred text class. So if you didn't, right, the Pentecost is in early Christian scripture where all the disciples are terrified in the upper room and they don't know if they're going to die, and they haven't seen, they don't know what the future of being alive is for them. And tongues of fire, it says, descend on their heads, and then they can all start speaking the power of God. We won't get into that too much, but it's the moment, right, of the power of God's Spirit, like spreading to all people. And is that the kind of better moment that's happening with the flames and Yoda, right? Is a kind of smashing, or is it an opening, right? Which we've already seen. We've already named all these places where the Force has been with people outside of a Jedi religion. And is this Luke's acknowledgement that the Force was not meant to be sort of only contained or mastered by a priestly caste?
I feel like that's a both and. Yeah. I mean, I feel like it is both in that moment and other points in The Last Jedi. There's definitely a sense of we're burning the idols, and happily so, and also that it is releasing so much life and energy into the universe. And it's not exactly that the burning, well, maybe it is, because the story in itself is that burning, right? And in doing so, and telling that kind of a Star Wars story, it is giving life and empowerment to all of these other characters, which I always thought it was just The Last Jedi. It's going on in The Force Awakens as well. It's just like a nascent idea, but in The Last Jedi, it's just fully realized that this is where we're at. So yeah, I love that. I love it in both ways.
And I think part of the point is that it's both. Like that because we forget, like the tree burns down, you're like, oh, the texts are all burned to death, and then like one of the last scenes in The Last Jedi is that we see that the books were actually taken by Rey, and she took a few of them, like, for special reading. And so apparently she will have read them, and Luke never did. But that to me is even interesting. Like, she's taking these to read, and like, Yoda makes fun of Luke because he clearly didn't read them, and and he's supposed to be the last Jedi. And so, like, I think it is kind of, both a little bit of being an iconoclast and just, let the past die, as Kylo said angrily many times. But also, that there is something to the past as well. Like, you get both of those things at the same time. And I think that the great critique is that from the film is that you're allowed to have those, and if you expect it to be simple, one way or another, you will be disappointed, either by yourself or by the mentor that you've taken on. And so, like, and I don't really have like a good end to that, because when I got to write reviews of these movies, because like that was the cool, like I got paid to do that. That was the best job I've ever had. And I remember like trying to grapple with, does this destroy like the myth? Like, does this ruin George Lucas's concept of a myth, and with it his concept of religion? But I think The Last Jedi answers that question by saying it never existed to begin with. And if it did, it probably shouldn't have. So,
do we have any more questions from the audience tonight? No? Oh, please.
Just kind of one more question, kind of off of that vein. I'm a huge fan of the expanded universe and a lot of the things that are in that. And in there we see the Jedi Order do some pretty questionable and heinous things, like their usage of Revan and kind of the whole being deceived by Darth Treya and then them having to be wiped out by the Jedi outcasts and like a restart button happen. So considering that and other things that they did, like the prequels and stuff like that, do you think it's time for the Jedi to die and be replaced by something like a Grey Order? Or do you think Rey should start it up again?
I hope she doesn't start it up again. And not, at least not in anything like its older form. That to me would be disappointing. I think something will go on, but I think maybe what we've seen is there are already lots of places where, right, even just within the canon and certainly expanded, right, lots of places where you could anchor communities, right, a kind of collective and communal sense of being force sensitive, wielding the force, that wouldn't have to be modeled on, right, the kind of old order. At least that's what I hope.
So as the Presbyterian on this panel, I'll revert to John Calvin and say that people in Jedi are all terrible. But I think that to your point, I love some EU. I was died a little bit inside when they retconned it all. Although it's kind of fun that they the new game is what they're going to bring back, what are they going to reference? But it was really dark in a lot of those different accounts. And I think what I think is the message of The Last Jedi and Rogue One in particular is that, and really honestly, The Force Awakens with the existence of Maz Kanata, is that the Force doesn't and shouldn't belong to the Jedi and the Sith. It should be something that it isn't given to warrior priest generals, which were the Jedi, who can just they can play these giant cosmic games with it to the detriment of the universe. And it should be a thing that is allowed to if not be accessed by everyone, because that may not be in the cards, at least not be controlled by a singular entity, and at least not in the way that the Jedi did. And so I would. What that looks like, I think, is kind of up to one of the weaknesses, I think, of the new trilogy is that their greatest strength is their greatest weakness. The emphasis they put on the characters and how much you care about the characters has come at the expense of building the giant universe. The universe felt more palpable in the original trilogy, and certainly it was half the existence of the prequels. Whereas the reason we care so much about these characters in these new trilogies is because they kind of keep the camera closer to them. But I would expect that in what I've seen of this universe that Rey inhabits, that we know that inequality still exists, and that that one little force-sensitive kid who's in the middle of nowhere, I doubt he's a Skywalker, right? And if I don't think we should reinstate an institution that comes and robs him and takes him away to someplace else so he can get involved in trade disputes. I think that maybe that kid could play a role right where he is right there and make that world a better place. And so I think that seems to be the goal of Rey, which is why she desperately wants to return to her home planet. And
Can't be a Skywalker. Just die inside.
Agreed. But
No, that'd be.
Do you know?
Although Wedge Antilles is coming back, so maybe she's an Antilles. I don't know. It's a lot of questions. But
the end of the series Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
Yes, that's what I was thinking, and I just thought no one's gonna want to go there. They're gonna be like, why? It's a Star Wars panel, not a Buffy panel. But that is the same eschatology. Yes. Yes.
All right, is everyone familiar with that?
Sorry.
So at the end, Buffy
That'll
the
be our
Vampire.
panel next year.
It should be.
Buffy nerddom goes.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer. To every generation, a Slayer is born, and there's only one supposedly, and her job is to slay vampires and other undead until she dies, which is usually pretty young, right? And over the course of the series, there are these moments where you meet other Slayers. There was a mistake, or I think she died at one point. Someone else has made a Slayer, but then she didn't really die.
She got brought back to life.
She gets brought back to life, right? So in the end, she comes up with this idea, and I can't remember how it's eventuated, or actualized.
Willa.
But is it through Willow? Mm-hmm. Is that there are a million potential Slayers out there. They're just waiting for her to die for one of them to be chosen. So instead of that creepy dark arc through this witch, they're all empowered. They all become slayers. Every single one of them. They're all women, right? So it's this incredibly exciting and empowering ending, which is not really about Jedi stuff. It's not like, and now they will form an institution which will later do trade disputes with vampires and things like that. It's just like this force of empowerment in the universe. So that, if there's some way that she could be that, or she...
To me, that is the perfect theological vision of spiritual power. That's it. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It's the only thing you need to watch, actually.
Check it out. Yeah, check that out.
Hi. Whoa. Thank you so much for speaking here tonight. I've really enjoyed it. I wrote my question down so I wouldn't forget. Earlier, you were comparing Star Wars to Star Trek, and as a fan of both those franchises, I did appreciate the comment when you said that Star Trek is kind of more static, and I definitely agree with that in reference to the original series. But the slept-on series, Deep Space Nine, the best one. I'm not sure if any of you have watched it.
Sure.
But that is another science fiction saga that does kind of include an element of religion with the Bajorans and the prophets. And I think that storytelling shows how religion and science and modernity can coexist. And I was just wondering how you think Star Wars exemplifies that relationship between science and religion.
Well, I'd argue that's one of the interesting elements of the Jesuit theme that we're embedded in right here, is because that I feel like the Jesuits de facto challenge that all the time, and so I mean it would be difficult to say I'm a Luddite Jedi, because how do you ignite your lightsaber, right? There's a lot of questions involved. Now, to be fair, Yoda goes and lives in a swamp and moves rocks around, but there is an element to which one thing that George Lucas used to talk about a lot is that one of the misunderstood or often unacknowledged narratives of Star Wars is the relationship between the droids and the humans and various creatures that they interact with. And that you come to the robots are the stand-in for you, the human, throughout the story. They're the great storytellers. You feel the most human connection to them, which is why I also love the droids in both Rogue One and Solo, because both of them challenge a lot of the tropes of just the observer droid, and one literally launches a revolution in Solo and frees her fellow droids. But again, what it does is that's just technology, but the premise of Star Wars, I've always felt, is that science and religion are at no point divorced. If anything, the greater question is whether or not religion or lack thereof, which one will misuse science more, right? And so, because that kind of becomes the premise of the prequels is you got robots versus clones, right? We're in a scenario where science is imbued on both sides there, and so I think Star Wars doesn't set up any sort of dichotomy between the two. It asks more important questions that I think are more relevant to our society, quite frankly. That pushes back on traditional tropes there.
No, I agree. That's a great take. I find I want to see a Disney Plus series or a movie that's just about droids. I feel like slowly we've been building this sense that, it's true in R2 and C-3PO.
And cartoon. There was a cartoon
droids. Yeah.
Is that right?
I forgot about that.
About maybe one season?
Yeah, it's deep cut. I forgot about that.
Wow, yeah, I have to check that out. Because there's such a humanity to them, and relationships that are different than they have with their owners or their partners or things like that. It'd be interesting to see more of that.
Time for one more question for the audience.
So we've known for a little while now that Emperor Palpatine is going to be returning in Rise of Skywalker, which is sort of completing this arc of him being the villain of all three trilogies. And I was wondering, from an eschatological sense, whether or not the sort of return of this figure, what does that mean, the sort of greater context, once, taking every single one of these movies and sort of ending it by returning to where that was, and like what that, what do you think that represents or means, or what that is trying to tell us?
I mean, I think that's maybe the best interpretation or question. That's the best way to think about why are they bringing him back. I mean, that to think of it like that is, this is a whole story. He is the sort of Satan figure that was present throughout it, so that it makes sense that at the end he would be present as well. I have trouble with it because it doesn't seem connected to the other two films at all, unless he's the voice that's been telling Ben Solo / Kylo Ren all along. He's been the voice in Darth Vader's helmet saying, you can be like me, you just have to do this. Because it doesn't happen in The Last Jedi, but in The Force Awakens, there's that scene where he's speaking to the helmet. So like, what was that? Was that, I sort of assumed it had been, the villain of that, the so-called villain, Snoke. I always want to call him Snoke.
We all forget him.
He's just, well, they never really gave him a story, right? Exactly. It just sort of happened. But maybe it's interesting. I don't know if I have an answer other than to say I appreciate that way of looking at the coming presence, supposedly, of Palpatine.
I agree completely. I'm really nervous. I mean, I'm going to just wait. I'm just waiting to see. I don't feel like I'll know how to interpret it till I see what happens with it. I will absolutely agree. I think trying to think how this is a technique to tie all 9 together. I suppose I'd rather Palpatine come back and be that technique than it all just be about Skywalker blood or something. I guess if I had to pick between the two, but I think maybe what I'm most worried about is that it suggests, right, that there's just this one evil that couldn't ever be gotten rid of, right? And then there's going to be some kind of final showdown, some really, really final time that will end it. And that seems to actually undercut the more complicated questions about good and evil that have been developing, I think, actually throughout all of them. So that's the thing that makes me the most nervous. I will admit there's a little part of me that's just nervous about my own desires for, when they...
I did that.
There's that, do you all ever think about this? Like, when this is over, like, are we, like, maybe more than the myth, maybe more than, like, Campbell's myth, I've realized that part of what makes Star Wars work for me, it's all about the rebellion and the resistance for me. And so any thought that will end, which, I do hope for the life world of the universe that it ends, but then I just think, are we just going to be back at, like, that Senate? Like, who wants to fight for that? Like, and so I think I feel torn because I think Palpatine coming back suggests this ultimate showdown, which makes me nervous about the kind of dualism of good and evil. And it also, it raises up for me this sense that, like, maybe truthfully the thing is I don't want them to ever stop fighting, because if they stopped fighting, then we would just have boringness. And while I want justice abstractly, like, justice actually doesn't ever look very fun.
And I'm grateful for your eschatological take, because that makes me hate it less. And so I will keep that in the back of my head if it turns out just to be like, and they cloned him. And, which, like, it's probably gonna happen. But I will say, I do, there is an element to which, the Emperor being the bad guy, one, it's very difficult to dismantle the Imperial project. And two, it's one of those things where there is an element of all of the series to which, like, evil is complicated, evil takes many different forms. It can be your closest ally and your best friend, of which Palpatine was both, right, to a lot of different people. And a horribly mangled individual. And so I think, but the fact that, like, it's always there, that it still exists, that evil, like, still permeates the ether. Again, Calvinist, so, like, that's always going to be part of my interpretation there. But at the same time, for these heroes, again, just to echo you again, like, if they stop fighting, then the project is complete. And I just don't think Star Wars is ever really about ending that struggle. If anything, it's about acknowledging that the struggle must continue for a new generation in a different way, and that you will build new institutions that you will then also have to dismantle because they will be inexact and imperfect, and try to make them better each time.
That's a super Calvinist take. I'm there for it. I'm right there.
Do our panelists have any short predictions for the film before we conclude?
You know, I'll tell you, I hope. I feel like this trilogy, in the original trilogy, you have the sort of seduction of Luke. Will he go to the dark side? And I feel like underlying this trilogy is the seduction of Ben, and it's whether he'll go to the light. And in each movie, that keeps coming up. It's very strange how it's the evil guy saying like, "You're so Snoke. You're so tempted to the light." I mean, I want to see that happen. I feel like the end of The Force Awakens, Han letting himself be killed by his son, the payoff of that has to be some sort of redemption for Ben, whether it means that he becomes good or he sacrifices himself or something. Like, I long for that. I feel like that character is more complicated than just decides to be a bad guy. So I want to see something of that in there.
I would be down for that. Yeah, I have no prediction. I have no predictions. I mean, I have lots of thoughts. I hope Rey doesn't have famous parents, and
Same, definitely
I hope
same.
that she unleashes the Force for all.
Yeah, my prediction is that Space Forces will be awesome, and I'm a big fan of Space Forces.
That's what they were in space, right?
Yeah,
They were riding.
Space Horses. Everything about this is awesome. But no, I don't care about the context. I just want them to exist. And my guess is that, like, I'm with you, like that there will be, whether it'll be redemption for Ben. I mean, a big narrative arc for Star Wars is some sort of element of redemption. But I feel like he's already, like, I just want them to continue with the complicated relationship between him and Rey that they set up in The Last Jedi. That's what I felt like was the strongest, most awesome part of that movie, was that sort of complicated relationship where now you're kind of like, is she going to go to the dark side? We had that other trailer with like evil Rey with like a double lightsaber for whatever reason. Is that like a dream? Like, you know, or like, was the whole idea of her like touching that glass structure in like the bowels of the island, like her like finding out she's a clone? Like, there's like a lot of different questions. But at the end of the day, like, I'm actually okay with those questions not being answered if what we do get is that a relationship between two people that matters and is impactful to both of them. And because I feel like the one running narrative throughout the entire Star Wars arc is that it's a lot of really hurt people who, like, their family are the friends that they've made and the robots that they've gotten to know, and maybe a movie or two. And so I just feel like that, to me, nothing says Star Wars more than for fighting for what you believe in and having a family that you build along the way. And so I just hope that family comes together. And the 3PO almost made me cry, so I feel like there's a strong chance that that's going to happen, but that's what I want more than anything else.
So I'd like to thank our panelists, Jack Jenkins, Kathryn Reklis, and Jim McDermott for joining us tonight.